All right, folks, so we're going to be talking now about the ancient Hebrews. This isn't going to be a super long lecture either because this is just the origins of the Hebrew people. And we're barely going to be covering it because honestly, we only have certain corroborated bits and pieces of evidence. The rest of it is kind of a summary of the origin story. And this is not the biblical story. This is kind of the names we do know, the background which we think happened, right? Because this is not a religion class, of course. This is a history class, and history is based on, like anthropology and any other academic science, is based on what we do know, or at least as close to it. With that said, I've got a disclaimer, right? Just like with the Sumerians and the epic tales of Gilgamesh, and the Babylonians and their stories, heck, even the Aztecs have an origin story that's pretty creative that we can't back up with anything. As with other early cultures, as I read the slide here, what we don't know from observable facts, we fill in with that culture's own ancient stories, at least until we do find something out that's specific and fact-based, and then it's great. These stories often conflict with each other. Here's why. They are from many different oral tales written down hundreds to thousands of years after the events that those tales talk about. Typically, the nomadic peoples coming out of actually Africa and out of Asia that settled in the areas that we're looking at, the Fertile Crescent and the Mediterranean, tended to be people who came thousands of years well before anybody had started writing things. And so at some point they start to write things, and that's great, but it's so long after their own stories of origin have occurred or been told or created that we don't really have any idea about what really happened or how those stories might have been embellished in any way, the way people do, because human beings are storytellers, and because we are storytellers, we tend to add interesting elements to those. Those students that were doing the assignment, the flood comparison between the Mesopotamians and the Israelites, their flood stories, I'd say 80% of the students thought that the Hebrew flood story was more interesting and creative than the Mesopotamian one. And some others, of course, thought the other way, and that's fine as well. It's just what happens is that some of the best storytellers, and I'm not saying real or not real, that's not my point, but some of the best tales or storytellers are the Hebrew people, in my opinion, when it comes to this part of the world. Absolutely amazing storytelling, and they began writing fairly early, enough that they could really put down an interesting timeline of their creation story, the big origin story that all cultures have, and then move on with that. It's just that they're all different people writing down different oral traditions from different tribes of Hebrew people that had different ways of looking at things over the ages. And some were influenced more by Babylonian culture, some are influenced by Phoenician culture, some are influenced by Egyptian culture, some are influenced by other Semitic and non-Semitic culture. And so they all come down to us in different forms that have a lot of different ways of looking at, well, culture, history, time, religion, right? So when we look at the Old Testament, for instance, so those original books of the Hebrew stories, they are so conflictory. And in this case, we don't really, we can't really split them out too much, except to say there are little bits and pieces that are corroborated by evidence from other cultures that were already writing before the Hebrews were. Okay, so here's something about the time methods. When you look at ancient biblical time reading, you're looking at often very nomadic forms of timekeeping, which was not uncommon for nomadic groups and still isn't. The timekeeping is not broken down into 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours and rotations of the sun around the earth, right? It's not based on that stuff. It is, wow, did I just say that? Rotations of the earth around the sun. Oh, hold on. Let me move forward into the Enlightenment with my heliocentrism. Anyway, the point being is that the method of timekeeping from even the nomadic Hebrews before they started writing things down, and even during, is very different from the kind of timekeeping we understand. And so people that are literalists try to put that together and usually have a hard time with it because, well, that's not the way these folks thought at all. All right. They didn't think about it in, well, 5 days and 22 minutes and 3 seconds. You know, they didn't have that form. It had to do with harvest seasons. It had to do with planting seasons. It had to do with following the animals during different seasons, you know, for hunting and gathering. It had to do with eventually adopting the systems of other cultures that had empires that the Hebrews had to live within, you know, that kind of thing, right? So it's all kind of a big mishmash of a very long history of a very ancient people, which I think is fun and interesting, but being a literalist with it is pretty much impossible if you want to be accurate, I guess, right? And some of the problems is that some of the words that come out of the original texts from thousands of years ago that come from a language that developed, you know, even more thousands of years ago, have words that have either many different forms of translations depending on who translated it. The ancient Greeks, the Romans, us, right? King, what's his name? You know, James the First of England, right? Everybody has a different cultural way to kind of spin a word without understanding the cultural nuance of the people, you know, from thousands of years ago necessarily. And there's a whole study, if you're into this stuff, there is a whole scholarship that is nothing more than trying to figure out the actual meanings of ancient words, especially when it comes down to the Hebrews, because of the central role they play in so many parts of the historical record. Okay, because it's so hard to do that, you know, and so we have words in the Old Testament, for instance, that we don't even have a translation for in our language. So we kind of make it up and hope it's okay, which is why, again, humans are great storytellers. And if we don't have empirical evidence, we just use the origin story that culture gives us. And that's why some of what I'm going to be telling you here in this short remainder of this PowerPoint doesn't really have a lot of backup evidence. It's just, you know, we're just putting the pieces together that we can for now. And there's a lot more. And even if you're not a religious person or of a different faith, reading the Old Testament, I think, is a fascinating thing to do, only because if you don't believe in the historical timeline necessarily, the stories and the culture it contains within from an ancient nomadic peoples that are trying to figure out that dualism between whether they settle down or stay nomadic, and as they grow, and then you've got 12 tribes, and then there's a kingdom, and it's this huge mess that happens as these people are trying to figure out who they are and what they want to be, and then empires come and conquer them, and these are known things, you know. And so I think it's kind of fun if you're into cultural studies to read that stuff, at least from that standpoint, if it's not about timeline standpoints. I just think. Let me give you something here. When it comes to religion, there's always arguments over interpretation. So here today, but also back in the ancient period, when it comes to Judaism, there are three, and then there's a bunch of subversions of this, okay? Three major families of interpretation of what the Old Testament meant and what the stories mean and how to understand them and how you live by them if you're a practicing religious Jewish person. Okay, and you could pause on here and read this if you'd like to, but right, you've got some that say you must live in rural communes and some that say go live in cities, right? Gentiles, yes or no. Property, you know, how do you handle it? Souls, what happens to you in the afterlife? This is all just the way people interpret the stories that were not written down for thousands of years. And if this is just the interpretation of general issues of life, you could also imagine how the three sects and then all the many sects within probably interpret things like time and location, right? Geography, everything. Does that make any sense? Let me show you this. Branches of Christianity that come off of the Jewish system, okay? Look how many there are. It started with one church, you know, because of the Romans, right? And the one Christian faith that basically grew in the Roman Empire as the Roman Empire began to collapse. And then you get different interpretations of how the Bible should work and what the interpretation of the religion is. There's a fight between two different factions, I should say, of the church. We call it the Great Schism. Schism is probably better, huh? And then you've got the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox, both which still exist today. And these are both a form of Catholic, but they're very different Catholic, right? Then you come over here, and by the time we get to the 1400s, you start to go from old original Catholic, then you've got the English Anglicanism. Thank you very much, Henry VIII. You then get this version of the Reformation here. Thank you, Martin Luther. And of course, more than Martin Luther, because we also have Methodism and Baptist and Presbyterianism and 1,000 other faiths that come right in here with Protestantism, then Pentecostalism, and then this thing called the Charismatic movement, right? And these all have 1,000, it seems like, not really, maybe dozens of sub-sects within them. Okay, why? Because each of these groups interprets the faith differently and interprets the words differently and the history differently. That's religion for you. It's true with any major religion. So, that's just the way it works. So I know some of you guys are if you are religious in this area, you are literalists of the Bible, right? 3,000 years ago, and this and that, and the other thing. And some of you aren't even Christian or Jewish at all. Some of you are agnostic or atheist or Muslim or anything else, right? And that's totally great, totally fine with me. It's just the point is that there's always, because Judaism and Christianity are still both very strong faiths that come out of this era of time. Because of that, we still have the ongoing debate and the arguments, and that's just the way it is, right? So I'm not going to get into literalism versus figuratism when it comes to interpretation of Jewish history. I'll just tell you what we know and fill in the gaps, and I'll tell you as I fill in the gaps. The one thing, the reason why this is so tough is because this region that we know as Israel today, actually Israel today is much smaller. It's much smaller. I'll show you a comparison map in a minute. But this was the kingdom of Israel at its height under Solomon, right? Massive, massive, powerful kingdom, but not for very long. It didn't last very long. And part of that is because the nomadic tribalism really never went away in the ancient period. And of course, you've still got the Phoenicians, who nobody's going to really conquer yet, okay? And you've got Egypt, which is only going to let you push them so far. And then you've got either the Hittites or the Assyrians or the Babylonians, okay? So this is the territory that Israel carves out for itself, where Canaan used to be, and then other territories up here. So there are three, if you look at this entire region, three major monotheistic religions that come out of here, not including the short-lived monotheistic religion that came in Egypt for a few years, right? Which was, of course, and is, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So this is a region that is hotly contested today, fought over today, a hotbed of faith and anger and fighting and doctrine today. And this is just why, because so many people come out of here or went back to here for whatever reason, for power and control and everything else, right? The Crusades are one of them. American troops are another, okay? World War II with a bunch of different groups going in here, a third. World War I had the same thing. It's just that this is a very important geographic area, and it's a connection between a lot of different countries for which trade is important. It was then, it is now. So let's take a look at this, right? Ancient Israel as a country, as a people calling themselves the Israelites, is about 4,000 years old, all right? The people, the nomadic people calling themselves Hebrews goes back maybe 11,000 years. So they've been around, as long as any other culture we've talked about, wandering around before they started to settle down. Why did these guys settle down later than, say, the Egyptians or various Mesopotamian cultures? Same reason that we've talked about before with like the Phoenicians and we'll talk about with others. The Jewish nomadic people, the tribes of Israel, if you will, did not settle along a river. By the time they showed up in this area from wherever they were coming from, kind of North Asia somewhere, by the time they show up, these folks here did not have anywhere along a river that naturally swelled and ebbed with crops growing on it naturally. There was nowhere for these groups to settle because they kind of wandered about away from that, trying to find somewhere to go, never did find somewhere to go, and ended up living inside of other empires until they built their own kingdom, and then eventually two different empires came and took over again. So the Hebrew people have a long history that they've recorded as much as they can, whether in stories or in factual history. And that history that they've been recording goes back a good 4,000 years, but they are a much older people than that. The patriarchs, some of which we have evidence for in some way or another, at least their name showing up in the cultures of other people, and some which we don't. We've got Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and Joshua, all major kind of leaders of powerful tribes of nomadic Hebrews that moved people around and found places to settle. For instance, Abraham with ancient Samaria coming from here, back in the Sumerian days, and traveling with a tribe. When I say a tribe, I'm talking about a tribe of nomads that may be several hundred people big. It could be somewhere between 50 or several hundred. And when you actually read about it, when you read their own histories that are written down, you could tell that these are big groups of people with a lot of families in them that have their own system of law that's unique to that tribal group, that family tribal group, and they're herding animals along with them, right? And so over the course of a couple decades, you've got this guy named Abraham, according to the origin story, with a little bit of proof and not much because it was just too long ago, right? Traveling up this way, back here, down this way, and finally beginning to settle right in this region right here, okay? And out of that big tribe of Abraham, we have the 12 tribes of Israel that kind of spread out from it. That's where you've got one tribe of people and the tribe's getting bigger, and so a family member of some kind takes off with his family and they grow into a large tribe eventually somewhere else, okay? It's just the way people expand. And so these are the 12 tribes of Israel that settle in Canaanite down here and basically Phoenician territory, right? Just, Phoenicia's really up here, but this is something that the Egyptians have claimed, the Assyrians have claimed, the Hittites have claimed, the Phoenicians have claimed over time. So over a period of time, the 12 tribes that came out of the one tribe, as far as we know, Abraham, expanded out and took this territory, and it was violent because they were a nomadic people that kept on kind of in their own little range of territory, okay, hunting and gathering until they settled and built farms and stuff. It took them a while to get there because, again, there's no river right here that gives the people that live here an automatic, easy way to be part of the Fertile Crescent. So these people have to act their existence completely out of the desert and Great Plains of this region. So these 12 tribes developed themselves usually by fighting against other peoples that already live here. So there's lots of stories. If you go through the first 4 books of the Old Testament, it's just fighting and fighting and fighting. It's so much fighting, so much warfare. And it's because the tribe of Abraham shows up, and then they expand out, and so the people are fighting the others that live here already for the territory. And they're overall successful over time. Okay, so what about the Egyptian story? How do some, not all, one tribe of Israelites end up in Egypt? How did that happen? We think, and there is a corroborating story in Egypt for this. There's a stele, actually, that talks about this a bit. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. That's the biblical story. Rises to become the second in command to the Pharaoh. That's a vizier, as you know already. We have evidence for this, okay? When famine comes, his brothers come to Egypt to get food, and the Pharaoh, who liked Joseph, and Joseph was powerful anyway as a vizier, Joseph may have been not of Egypt, but he was a person that could read and write and was good at planning. And so Joseph is going to be somebody that the Pharaoh hires as a trusted person. And that means that when Joseph says, can I bring a couple hundred people of my entire tribe into Egypt, the Pharaoh lets them move into the Delta, where so many other cultures moved into, to the chagrin of the Egyptians over time. Think like the Hyksos and the Sea People, right? Okay, so when that Pharaoh dies, that tolerant Pharaoh dies, eventually, as Joseph's family grows, meaning his tribe, when we say family, we mean tribe, grows into a few thousand people, there is going to be an Egyptian king, a Pharaoh, that is going to conquer this large group of people that keeps on taking over more Egyptian territory and enslaves that tribe. And so there's a victory stele that I'm going to show you a guy talking about right now. I think it's kind of interesting.
This stela is what the Egyptians would have called a triumph stela, a victory stela, commemorating victory over foreign peoples.
Most of the hieroglyphic inscription celebrates Merneptah's triumph over Libya, his enemy to the west. But almost as an afterthought, he mentions his conquest of people to the east in just 2 lines.
The text reads, Ashkelon has been brought captive, Gezer has been taken captive, Yanoam in the North Jordan Valley has been seized, Israel has been shorn, its seed no longer exists.
History proves the pharaoh's confident boast to be wrong. Rather than marking their annihilation, Merneptah's stela announces the entrance onto the world stage of a people named Israel.
This is priceless evidence for the presence of an ethnical group called Israel in the central highlands of southern Canaan.
The well-established Egyptian chronology gives the date as 1208 BC. Merneptah's stela is powerful evidence that a people called the Israelites are living in Canaan, in what today includes Israel and Palestine, over 3,000 years ago.
Okay, so we have this other story about the Egyptians letting a group of Jewish people, the descendants of the Joseph tribe, leave Egypt and go into where the rest of the tribes were. And, you know, along that part of Old Canaan and just south of Phoenicia. And so it's the end of the 13th century BCE, okay? Moses, you know, it's a name that we do see around a little bit, but we're not really sure if that was his actual name. We're not sure who the actual guy was. We don't have enough evidence that talks about this guy named Moses. And so it doesn't help us much, but he leads that one tribe out of bondage in Egypt sometime after, we think, Ramses II, although a lot of people keep on erroneously saying it was during Ramses II's or Ramses the Great's era. And in reality, we think it was probably just after. Anyway, we have this parting of the Red Sea, which we have evidence that along the shore that happens, where that tribe of Israel was able to cross into a different region, and the Egyptians couldn't follow. We don't have any evidence of people actually following the tribe that was being let go and of all the plagues and all that stuff. We just have the stories. That's all we've got. And so that this whole slide is based entirely on the stories that are in the Old Testament, as opposed to anything that's corroborated by some observable fact. It's a people telling us what happened to them thousands of years, actually in this case hundreds of years after it apparently happened. But Moses leads Israel, gathers even more tribes of people together to Mount Sinai. They're looking for a place to live, and they get a law code, much of which is based right off of the earlier Code of Hammurabi, which is probably something that these tribes knew about because they had dealings and had passed through Babylon, and Babylon had dealings with this region of the Western Crescent as well. Okay, so the Ten Commandments largely based off of the very same concepts that people have known for some time already, and they're looking for in the Bible a promised land in the Old Testament, and that promised land is a territory that they've been looking to settle for a while, which is right next to the Phoenicians, where Canaan is. So 40 years of wandering, that's the story. We don't know if it was really 40 years or anything like that. We have no idea. Okay, so Mount Sinai is right here. Here is the understood, at least in the stories, of the travels of the Hebrew people coming out of, not only just the ones that escaped from Egypt as slaves, and that's how that happened, but also the other 12 tribes that came to join them who were not part of this. And they travel down Mount Sinai's here, where the legal code was found or created or given to the people by God, right? And then all the way back up here, and you've got the people traveling all this way. Apparently, this took 40 years, which makes sense to me, all the way up to Canaan, which is essentially right here, just south of Phoenicia, just above Egyptian territory, which kind of wraps around to here. Anyway, there's Mount Sinai. You've never seen it. Kind of cool. There's stuff on top of there now. Looks like it's, I don't know how tall that really is, but it almost seems like maybe a Saddleback Mountain for you Orange County people. I don't know. I've never been up it. I want to go see it. Okay, so you've got this code, right? Do not worship other gods. That is not a Babylonian thing because they were polytheists. Do not make any idols. That's not Babylonian. That's unique to these guys, to the Hebrews. Do not misuse the name of God. There is a lot of discussion over what that even means, by the way. Is it take name in vain? That's not what it says. It's just misuse the name of God in what way? That's kind of fun to debate. Keep the Sabbath holy. That is a Hebrew thing, specifically. Honor your father and mother. This is a simple way of stating the same sort of thing that Hammurabi had. Do not murder. Hammurabi had it. Do not commit adultery. Hammurabi had it. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not covet. All things that are real basic tenets of human cultures since Hammurabi. Probably before. Just he was the first to write the kind of stuff down that this stuff expands into. Okay. So the covenant with his people, the main histories of the Hebrew people and their origin stories and their laws all come out of the first 5 books of the Bible, all right, or what is now compiled as the Bible. It used to be in scrolls like this, it still is, but I don't think if anybody wants to read the Old Testament, they go buy scrolls like this. They go buy a book, right? And this would be so much more fun. Anyway, right, so that's the sacred text right there. The Torah. I should have said the name of it, the Torah. Okay. So King David's the first real king of Egypt that unites the 12 tribes some 40, 50, 60 years after the exodus from Egypt. And that's going to be right here. There's going to be a little bit of an empire that you notice does not include the Phoenician territory that's over here, right? Or here. This is protected right here. Okay. Nobody's going to mess with the Phoenicians. And this is basically the Canaanite people, all right, and Western Mesopotamians, and so there's David's kingdom. There's lots of stories of King David. We don't have much proof for any of it. It's still interesting. But he was a king of conquest. He was always fighting because he conquered this entire region as a kingdom. Obviously, much bigger than Israel is today. So, right here, the extent of the empire, 103 to 101. That's right about the time when King David died. So there's his empire at the time of his death. That's pretty good, right? Now let's look at Solomon. That comes. There's some kings in between, and then Solomon comes in 970. Rules between 970 to 931, and he expands the empire even bigger. The kingdom of Israel is this massive kingdom that goes from here, right? Took over some of the Hittite territory and pushed them back. Babylonians, Assyrians, Sumerians are all looking on in awe as the kingdom of Israel expands to such a large territory. Here is this green is where Israel is now. All right, gives you an idea of the size that we're talking about. After Solomon died, there was just a slow decline as the different tribal groups that lived within this kingdom started to fight each other over how things should be. Solomon was just a very strong king, and so was David. Both very strong leaders, which were able to kind of keep things together. But here's what happens. All right, this is the beginning of the city of Jerusalem and the building of the famous first temple under David, much of which was parts imported by the Phoenicians into Israel. Okay, and so you've got the temple as Solomon was building it because he kept it going, right? You've got that thing called the Ark of the Covenant that, of course, if you ever watched Indiana Jones, the first one, there's some discussion about that. That's something fun to talk about. Does the Ark of the Covenant still exist? Because it was carried away by the Babylonians. I think it could be the Assyrians. I might be wrong. Anyway, it was carried away by a conqueror. So the question then is what happened to it? Was it saved or melted down? And there's some people that think it might be in Ethiopia somewhere, and others that think it's just buried somewhere, and others that think that it probably just doesn't exist anymore. That it definitely did, but doesn't now. So what happened? Over time, after Solomon died, Israel was unable to reconcile itself with itself, and so you're going to see a split, okay? And the split is going to be Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Two different kings, right? And the Hittites are now expanding back and taking over again in the north. So right here you've got Israel, and right here you've got Judah. Both fairly powerful kingdoms, although Judah was apparently the more powerful kingdom. Israel conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. And one thing that the Assyrians were really famous for was splitting peoples apart and putting them into different parts of the Assyrian Empire so they could never rebel, gather together and rebel. So the Assyrians conquered this part, the kingdom of Israel. Now Judah, the kingdom of Judah, will be destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. So this area here is going to be captured by the Babylonians. And those folks will be held in exile and spread throughout the Babylonian Empire. So Assyria was kind of to the west, and Babylon and the Babylonian Empire is going to be over, again, pretty close to where ancient Samaria was on the other side. So just as part of the story, all these guys will get released when the Persian Empire grows, takes over where Assyria used to be and Babylon was, takes over the entire Fertile Crescent, and there's this king named Cyrus, we'll talk about him later, who is going to gather up all the Hebrew people and send them back to Israel and basically do what the U.S. and Britain did back in 1948. They're going to say, hey, this is Israel again, move back in there, rebuild your temple, and do your thing. So basically Cyrus, a Persian, is going to be the one that creates the second kingdom of Israel. And then today we of course have the third version of Israel. Okay. Different idea here if we want to do a closer look. Again, here's Phoenicia, right? The Phoenician territory. And then right here, kingdom of Judah at its height, and here's where Jerusalem was, or is. And right here, the kingdom of Israel at its height after the two had broken apart. Okay? It's kind of fun to see this stuff. So where do the Assyrians and the Babylonians take everybody? Well, in the purple, that's where the Assyrians send people, right? All over the place. The green is where the people of Judah, the southern Jews, were sent, all right, all over here into this part of Babylonia. And then you're going to see this, Gentiles, meaning people from here. People who are not Jews are going to be taken from in here and sent back this way to settle this region and basically make it so that it would be really hard for Hebrews to move back, in any kind of escape or future time. Basically, again, the Assyrians move people from here to here and people from here to here. Why do they do it? Because, ladies and gentlemen, that's how they split people apart and kept fights from happening within their empire. So a little bit about today, okay? Here's modern day Israel. And modern day Israel was put together by a committee of people right during the end of World War II. And that committee of people in the Allies were trying to find a way to give some place for millions of Jewish refugees from throughout Europe to go. And there was nobody where all the refugees had gone and they were in camps and otherwise escaped or exiled. Jewish refugees from all over the world, especially within Central Europe, had nowhere to go because nobody would take them in really after the war. World War II, war-torn Europe was an absolute mess, and taking in millions of people and to feed them and have them become refugees in your land was just not something that people were going to offer to do, unfortunately. And so in 1948, Britain, who was a colonizer here, decided that they didn't need the colony anymore. So as they were leaving, they said, why don't we just let this be Israel? Now, the problem with that is that after we move forward a few thousand years, there's already a people that live here, right? And this is nothing new. I mean, when we talk about history, we look at all these people that come and go and come and go and come and go. Well, in modern times, here we are. And what you're looking at is that this whole region was peopled by an Arabic people who are still there, known as the Palestinians. And so the Palestinians were under the rule mostly of England when we get to the 1940s. And England and the United States, the big winners of World War II in the end, are going to literally, not including Russia, are going to literally just spread this thing up, cut this up, just carve this out, and send all the Hebrew refugees to here and create a country. Well, what do you do with the Palestinians, right, who already live in this whole region? It's kind of like somebody coming here I live in Irvine. Imagine, Canada says, hey, we need you guys all to leave your homes and go move over here somewhere, into the Mojave Desert, because we're going to move refugees from Chile into your city of Irvine. So make sure you leave behind anything you don't need, because those guys will need it from Chile, and enjoy the Mojave. Here's a couple bucks, right? That's what happened. And so there's a reason why people are so mad when we come to all the fighting in there. It's just unfortunate, right? It's not that I don't think that Israel needs and deserves a state. It's just that this is an interesting way to make it happen. That's never going to, be settled in some peaceful manner. I'm sorry, it's just not. So the people of Israel have a claim to this region that goes back 3,000 years. When you've got David and Solomon. The Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian Palestinians, right, says that they have had this territory since the Romans essentially drove out the last people of Israel who had set up a kingdom between the Exodus, where the Persians sent them back in Rome. Okay, then you've got Arabic people in general that says, well, Mohammed-led peoples conquer the area in the 7th century. So therefore, this belongs to them too. So the deal is that there are three major groups that constantly fight over this territory politically or actually fight, right? And that's a fight that's just never really going to end, because it's such an important region. There you go. So could you imagine if the Phoenicians and the Canaanites still existed? They would be able to say, yeah, well, we were here before all you guys. It's just that they don't exist anymore as separate cultures. All right. So anyway, I think that's it for our intro into Israel. You guys take care.